Hey there, I'm Erica Koenig-Workman, and I'm reading to you from the Desert Fathers. And I'm reading to you from Chapter 1, The Life of St. Paul, the First Hermit. There is a variant reading in some of the manuscripts which suggests that the Vita S. Pauli was written during Jerome's own years in the desert, before he found his vocation. He had had his boyhood in Dalmatia, his learning and a young man's pleasures, and the beginning of his book collecting in Rome, had gone a scholar's journey to Treves, copying manuscripts, made some of the friendships of his life at Aquileia, and finally broke away to wander in what he called an uncertain pilgrimage through Greece and Anatolia. The blazing heat in Cilicia struck him down, and he headed through Syria to find safe harbor for my wreck. In Antioch, where his friend Evagrius seems to have preceded him. For Evagrius, the journey from Italy was a homecoming, for he had great wealth and a country house at Maronia, about 28 miles south of Antioch. For Jerome, it was the first stage of the pilgrimage that was literally to end in the coming of the fourth of the wise men to Bethlehem, with his ambiguous gifts of exquisite scholarship and a bitter tongue. Meantime, he was not yet 30, and passionate for Cesaro. The country house at Maronia was agreeable. Evagrius, a generous patron there, had always someone at hand to copy a manuscript, and there were 3 friends, Innocent, Hylas, and Helidorus, as delightful as their names. But the desert was too near the town for the peace of mind of a sensitive young man. Malchus, innocent and old, was to be seen at church every day, with his epic years of desert sanctity behind him. Theodosius of Rosas, a hermit, so austere and so kind that the sailors on those coasts abandoned their familiar deities in any serious peril to cry on Theodosius's God, was a dangerous correspondent. Evagrius himself was either working on or had already finished his translation of the life of Saint Antony, in itself enough to kindle a passion for the absolute that not even Cesaro's suavity could assuage. And then Innocent died, and after him Hylas. By 375, Jerome was solitary in the desert of Chalcis. And what he suffered there, he told years after to his girl pupil, Eustochium, with the regret of appeased middle age for the exaltation and misery of youth. Oh, how many times did I, set in the desert, in that vast solitude, parched with the fires of the sun, that offers a dread abiding to the monk. How often did I think myself back in the old Roman enchantments. There I sat, solitary, full of bitterness. My disfigured limbs shuddered away from my sackcloth. My dirty skin was taking on the hue of the Ethiopian's flesh. Every day tears, every day sighing. And if in spite of my struggles, sleep would tower over and sink upon me, my battered body ached on the naked earth. Of food and drink I say nothing, since even a sick monk uses only cold water, and to take anything cooked is wanton luxury. Yet that same I, who for fear of hell condemned myself to such a prison, I, the comrade of scorpions and wild beasts, was there, watching the maidens in their dances, my face haggard with fasting, my mind burnt with desire in my frigid body, and the fires of lust alone leaped before a man prematurely dead. So destitute of all aid, I used to lie at the feet of Christ, watering them with my tears, wiping them with my hair, struggling to subdue my rebellious flesh with 7 days fasting. I do not blush to confess the misery of my hapless days. Rather, could I weep that I am not what I was once. I remember crying out till day became one with night, nor ceasing to beat my breast until my Lord would chide and tranquility return. I grew to dread even my cell with its knowledge of my imaginings, and grim and angry with myself would set out solitary to explore the desert, and wherever I would spy the depth of a valley or a mountainside or a precipitous rock, there was my place of prayer, there the torture house of my unhappy flesh, and the Lord himself is witness, after many years and eyes that clung to heaven, I would sometimes seem to myself to be one with the angelic hosts. He left the desert after 5 years, and though he was afterwards to cry, quote, "Then the desert held me, would that it had never let me go," unquote. It is to be remembered that Jerome was a Virgilian romantic. Even in this life of the first hermit, Antony, who distrusted literature, is tripped up by a quotation from the Aeneid at every step. Quote, "I toiled hard," unquote, said Jerome ruefully, quote, "to deject my style, but however it comes, you may fill a jar with water, and it still will smell of the wine that steeped it first," unquote. For Jerome's books went with him in the desert. For many a year, he says, quoting, "Had I cut myself off from home and parents and sister and kin, and what is harder than these, the habit of exquisite dining. But the library I had built up with such ardor and pains in Rome, I could not bring myself to do without," unquote. The solitude of the desert drove him not to silence, but to the mastering of another language. No fasting could tame the intolerable energy of his imagination. He must have something craggy to break his mind upon, and he found it in Hebrew. Quote, "When I was a young man," unquote, he wrote to his friend Rusticus, "and the solitude of the desert walled me in, I could not endure the stinging of my lusts, the heat of my nature. The flesh I might try to break with frequent fasting, but my mind was seething with imagination, so to tame it I gave myself up for training to one of the brethren, a Hebrew who had come to the faith, and so, after the subtlety of Quintilian, the flowing river of Cicero, the gravity of Fronto, and the gentleness of Pliny, I began to learn another alphabet, and meditate on words that hissed and words that gasped. What toil I spent, what difficulty I endured, how many times despaired and threw it up, how many times contemptuously returned to begin anew. My own conscience is witness that endured it, and those that lived their life beside me. And I thank God that out of that bitter seed of letters I plucked so sweet a fruit," unquote. Christendom had still more reason to thank God. The final vintage was to be the Vulgate translation of the Old Testament. He was still working on in Hebrew in his old age. Meantime, however, the sufferings of an Italiate body in the Syrian desert, combined with the internecine warfare of 3 bishops of Antioch over the 3 hypostases of the Trinity to drive him back, first Constantinople and then to the adamant security of St. Peter's See, and the familiar lyrical enchantment of Rome. The wise Pope Damascus had divined where his genius lay, and set him to his master work of translation, first from the Greek, recension after recension, and the rich amenities of scholarly controversy were to keep him happy till he died. But when he made the bibliography of his own books from his catalogue of illustrious men, the Vita S. Pauli came first in the list. And when, after a long silence, he began to write again in Bethlehem, it was the story of Malchus of the desert, and he had heard from him a lifetime before, in the good old days at Marionia. Quote, "This is the story, Malchus, that was an old man, told to me that was a young one, and this I will tell you, now that I am old. And do ye tell it to those that come after you, how amid swords and deserts and wild beasts, chastity never was captive, and how a man devoted to Christ may die, but cannot be defeated." Unquote. The Life of St. Paul, the First Hermit, Prologue. There's a good deal of uncertainty abroad as to which monk it was who first came to live in the desert. Some, questing back to a remoter age, would trace the beginning from the Blessed Elias and from John. Yet of these, Elias seems to us to have been rather a prophet than a monk, and John to have become to prophesy before ever he was born. Some, on the other hand, and these have the crowd with them, insist that Antony was the founder of his way of living, which in one sense is true, not so much that he was before all others, as that it was by him their passion was wakened. Yet Amathus, who buried the body of his master, and Macarius, both of them Antony's disciples, now affirm that a certain Paul of Thebes was the first to enter on the road. This is my own judgment, not so much from the facts as from conviction. Some tattle this and that as the fancy takes them, and a man in an underground cavern with hair to his heels, and the like fantastic inventions which it were idle to track down. A lie that is impudent needs no refuting. So then, since there is a full tradition as regards Antony, both in the Greek and Roman tongues, I have determined to write a little of Paul's beginning and his end, rather because the story has been passed over than confident of any talent of mine. But what was his manner of life in middle age, or what wiles of Satan he resisted, has been discovered to none of mankind. The life. During the reign of Decius and Valerian, the persecutors, about the time when Cornelius at Rome, Cyprian at Carthage, split their glorious blood, a fierce tempest made havoc of many churches in Egypt and Thebaid. It was the Christian's prayer in those days that he might, for Christ's sake, die by the sword. But their crafty enemies sought out torments, wherein death came slowly, desiring rather to slaughter the soul than the body. And, as Cyprian wrote, who was himself to suffer, they long for death, and dying is denied to them. Now at this very time, while such deeds as these were being done, the death of both parents left Paul heir to great wealth in the lower Thebaid. His sister was already married. He was then about 15 years of age, excellently versed alike in Greek and Egyptian letters, of a gentle spirit, and a strong lover of God. When the storm of persecution began at Sunder, he betook himself to a farm in the country for the sake of its remoteness and secrecy. But, quote, "What wilt thou not drive mortal hearts to do, O thou dread thirst for gold?" Unquote. His sister's husband began to mediate the betrayal of the lad whom it was his duty to conceal. Neither the tears of his wife, nor the bond of blood, nor God looking down upon it all from on high, could call him back from the crime, spurred on by a cruelty that seemed to ape religion. The boy, far-sighted as he was, had the wit to discern it, and took flight to the mountains, there to wait while the persecution ran its course. What had been his necessity become his free choice? What had been his necessity became his free choice. Little by little, he made his way, sometimes turning back and again returning, till at length he came upon a rocky mountain, and at its foot, at no great distance, a huge cave, its mouth closed by a stone. There was a thirst in men to pry into the unknown. He moved the stone, and eagerly exploring came within a spacious courtyard, open to the sky, roofed by the wide spreading branches of an ancient palm, and with a spring of clear shining water. A stream ran hasting from it, and was soon drunk again through a narrow opening, by the same earth that had given its waters birth. There were, moreover, not a few dwelling places in that hollow mountain, where one might see chisels and anvils and hammers for the minting of coin. Egyptian records declare that the place was a mint for coining false money, at the time that Antony was joined to Cleopatra. So then, in his beloved habitation, offered to him, as it were, by God himself, he lived his life through in prayer and solitude. The palm tree provided him with food and clothing. Unless this should seem impossible to any, I call Jesus to witness and his holy angels that I myself, in that part of the desert which marches with Syria and the Saracens, have seen monks, one of whom lived a recluse for 30 years, on barley bread and muddy water, another in an ancient well, which is in the heathen speech of Syria, is called a kuba, kept himself in life on 5 dry figs a day. These things will seem incredible to those who believe not that all things are possible to him that believeth. But to return to that place from which I have wandered, for 113 years the blessed Paul lived the life of heaven upon earth, while in another part of the desert Antony abode, an old man of 90 years. And as Antony himself would tell, there came suddenly into his mind the thought that no better monk that he had his dwelling in the desert. But as he lay quiet that night, it was revealed to him that there was deep in the desert another better by far than he, and that he must make haste to visit him. And straightway, as day was breaking, the venerable old man set out, supporting his feeble limbs on his staff, to go he knew not whither. And now came burning noon, the scorching sun overhead. Yet would he not flinch from the journey begun, saying, I believe in God, that he will show me his servant, as he said. Hardly had he spoken when he espied a man that was part horse, whom the imagination of the poets has called the hippocantor. At sight of him, the saint did arm his forehead with the holy sign. "How there," he said, "in what part of the country hath this servant of God his abode?" The creature gnashed out some kind of barbarous speech, and rather grinding his words than speaking them, sought with his bristling jaws to utter as gentle discourse as might be. Holding out his right hand, he pointed out the way, and so made swiftly off across the open plains and vanished from the saint's wandering eyes. And indeed, whether the devil had assumed this shape to terrify him, or whether, as might well be, the desert that breeds monstrous beasts begot this creature also, we have no certain knowledge. So then, Antony, in great amaze, and turning over in his mind that thing that he had seen, continued on his way. Nor was he long till in a rocky alley, that he saw a dwarfish figure of no great size, its nostrils joined together, and its forehead bristling with horns. The lower part of its body ended in goat's feet. Unshaken by the sight, Antony, like a good soldier, caught up the shield of faith and the buckler of hope. The creature thus described, however, made to offer him dates as tokens of peace, and perceiving this, Antony hastened his step, and asking him who he might be, had this reply: "Mortal am I, and one of the dwellers in the desert, from the heathen worship astray in diverse error, calling us fauns and satyrs and incubi. I come on an embassy from my tribe. We pray thee that thou wouldest entreat for us our common God who did come. We know from the world's salvation, and his sound hath gone forth all over the earth." Hearing him speak thus, the old wayfarer let his tears run down, tears that sprang from the mighty joy that was in his heart, for he rejoiced for Christ's glory and the fall of Satan, marveling that he could understand his discourse, and striking the ground with his staff. "Woe to thee, Alexandria," he cried, "who dost worship monsters in room of God. Woe to thee, harlot city, in whom the demons of all the earth have flowed together. What hast thou now to say? The beasts speak Christ, and thou dost worship monsters in room of God." He had not yet left speaking when the frisky creature made off as if on wings. And this, lest any hesitation should stir in the incredulous, is maintained by universal witness during the reign of Constantinus. For a man of this type was brought alive to Alexandria, and was made a great show for the people, and his lifeless corpse was thereafter preserved with salt, lest it could disintegrate in the heat of summer, and brought to Antioch to be seen by the emperor. But to return to my purpose. Antony continued to travel through the region he had entered upon, now gazing at the tracks of wild beasts, and now at the vastness of the broad desert. What he should do, whither he should turn, he knew not. The second day had ebbed to its close. One still remained, if he were not to think that Christ had left him. All night long he spent the darkness in prayer, and in the doubtful light of dawn he saw a she-wolf, panting in a frenzy of thirst, steal into the foot of the mountain. He followed her with his eyes, and coming up to the cave into which she had disappeared, began to peer within. But his curiosity availed him nothing. The darkness repelled his sight. Yet perfect love, as the scripture saith, casteth out fear. Holding his breath and stepping cautiously, the wary explorer went in. Advancing little by little, and often standing still, his ear caught a sound. Afar off, in the dread blindness of the dark, he saw light. Hurrying too eagerly, he struck his foot against a stone and raised a din. At the sound, the blessed Paul shut the door, which had been open, and bolted it. Then did Antony fall upon the ground outside the door, and there he prayed for admittance into the 6th hour, and beyond it. Who I am, said he, and whence and why I have come, thou knowest. I know that I am not worthy to behold thee. Nevertheless, unless I see thee, I go not hence. Thou who receivest beasts, why dost thou turn away men? I have sought, and I have found. I knock, that it may be opened to me. But if I prevail not, here shall I die before thy door. Assuredly, thou wilt bury my corpse. And so he stood, pleading, and fixed there. To him the hero answered in few words. No man pleads thus, who comes to threaten. No man comes to injure, who comes in tears. And dost thou marvel that I receive thee not, if it is a dying man that comes? And so jesting, Paul set open the door. And the two embraced each other and greeted one another by their names, and together returned thanks to God. And after the holy kiss, Paul sat down beside Antony and began to speak. Behold him whom thou hast sought with so much labor, a shaggy white head and limbs worn out with age. Behold, thou lookest on a man that is soon to be dust. Yet because love endureth all things, tell me, I pray thee, how fares the human race? If new roofs be risen in the ancient cities, whose empire is it that now sways the world? And if any still survive, snared in the air of demons. And as they talked, they perceived that a crow had settled on a branch of the tree, and softly flying down, deposited a whole loaf before their wondering eyes. For their wondering eyes. And when he had withdrawn, behold, said Paul, God hath sent us our dinner. God the merciful, God the compassionate. It is now 60 years since I have yet had each day a half loaf of bread. But at thy coming, Christ hath doubled his soldiers' rations. And when they had given thanks to God, they sat down beside the margin of the crystal spring. But now sprang up a contention between them as to who would break the bread that brought the day well nigh to evening, Paul insisting on the right of the guest, Antony countering by right of seniority. At length they agreed that each should take hold of the loaf and pull toward himself, and let each take what remained in his hands. Then they drank a little water, holding their mouths to the spring, and offering to God the sacrifice of praise, they passed the night in vigil. But as day returned to earth, the blessed Paul spoke to Antony. From old time, my brother, I have known that thou wert a dweller in these parts. From old time God promised that thou, my fellow servant, wouldst come to me. But since the time has come for sleeping, and for I have never desired to be dissolved and to be with Christ, the race is run. But since the time has come for sleeping, and for I have ever desired to be dissolved and to be with Christ, the race is run. There remaineth for me a crown of righteousness. Thou hast been sent by God to shelter this poor body in the ground, returning earth to earth. At this, Antony, weeping and groaning, began pleading with him not to leave him, but to take him with him as a fellow traveler on that journey. Thou must not, said the other, seek thine own, but another's good. It were good for thee, the burden of the flesh flung down, to follow the Lamb, But it is good for the other brethren that they should have thine example for their grounding. Wherefore, I pray thee, unless it be too great a trouble, go and bring the cloak which Athanasius the bishop gave thee to wrap around my body. This indeed the blessed Paul asked, not because he much cared whether his dead body, should rot, covered or naked, for indeed he had been clothed for so long in woven palm leaves, but he would have Antony far from him, that he might spare him the pain of his dying. Then Antony, amazed that Paul should have known for Athanasius and the cloak, dared make no answer. It seemed to him that he saw Christ in Paul, and he worshipped God in Paul's heart, silently weeping. And he kissed his eyes and his hands, and he set out on the return journey to the monastery, the same which in after time was captured by the Saracens. His steps indeed could not keep pace with his spirit, yet though length of days had broken a body worn out with fasting, his mind triumphed over his years. Exhausted and panting, he reached his dwelling. The journey ended. 2 disciples who of long time had ministered to him ran to meet him, saying, Where hast thou so long tarried, Master? Woe is me, he made answer, that do falsely bear the name of monk. I have seen Elias, I have seen John in the desert, yea, I have seen Paul in paradise. And so, with tight pressed lips and his hand beating his breast, he carried the cloak from his cell to his disciples, eager to know more of what was toward. He answered, There is a time to speak, and there is time to be silent. And leaving the house, and not even taking some small provision for the journey, he again took the road by which he had come, athirst for him, longing for the sight of him, eyes and mind intent. For he feared, as indeed befell, that in his absence Paul might have rendered back to Christ the spirit that he owed him. And now the second day dawned upon him, and for 3 hours he had been on the way, when he saw amid a host of angels and amid the companies of prophets and apostles, Paul climbing the steeps of heaven and shining white as snow. And straightway, falling on his face, he threw sand upon his head and wept, saying, Paul, why dost thou send me away? Why dost thou go with me with no leave-taking? So tardy to be known art thou, so swift to go. In after time, the blessed Antony would tell how speedily he covered the rest of the road, as it might be like a bird flying. Nor was it without cause. Entering the cave, he saw on its bent knees, the head erect and the hands stretched out to heaven, the lifeless body, yet first thinking he yet lived, he knelt and prayed beside him. Yet no accustomed sigh of prayer came to him. He kissed him, weeping, and then knew that the dead body of the holy man still knelt and prayed to God, to whom all things live. So then he wrapped the body round and carried it outside, chanting the hymns and the psalms of Christian tradition. But sadness came on Antony, because he had no spade to dig the ground. His mind was shaken, turning his way, this way and that. For if I should go back to the monastery, he said, it is 3 days' journey. If I stay here, there is no more that I can do. Let me die, therefore, as is meet, and falling beside thy soldier, Christ, let me draw my last breath. But even as he pondered, behold, 2 lions came coursing their manes flying from the inner desert, and made towards him. At sight of them, he was at first in dread. Then, turning his mind to God, he waited undismayed, as though he looked on doves. They came straight to the body of the holy dead, and halted by wagging their tails, and then crouched themselves at his feet, roaring mightily. And Antony well knew they were lamenting him as best they could. Then, going a little way off, they began to scratch up the ground with their paws, vying with one another and throwing up the sand, till they had dug a grave roomy enough for a man. And thereupon, as though to ask the reward of their work, they came up to Antony with drooping ears and down-bent heads, licking his hands and his feet. He saw that they were begging for his blessing and pouring out his soul in praise to Christ, for that even the dumb beasts feel that there is God. "Lord," he said, "without whom no leaf lights from the tree, nor a single sparrow falls upon the ground, give unto these even as thou knowest." Then, motioning with his hand, he signed to them to depart. And when they had gone away, he bowed his aged shoulders under the weight of the holy body, and laying it in the grave, he gathered the earth above it, and made the wonted mound. Another day broke, and then, lest the pious their hair should receive none of the goods of the intestate, he claimed for himself the tunic which the saint had woven out of palm leaves, as one weaves baskets. And so, returning to the monastery, he told the whole story to his disciples, in order as it befell, and on the solemn feasts of Easter and Pentecost, he wore the tunic of Paul. I pray you, whoever ye be who read this, that ye be mindful of Jerome the sinner, who, if the Lord gave him his choice, would rather have the tunic of Paul with his merits than the purple of kings with their thrones. And that's the end of chapter 1. A reading from the Desert Fathers. The history of the monks. The life of St. Paul, the first hermit, by St. Jerome. So thank you very much for listening and for being with me. And God bless you. I hope these readings stir up your imagination and your heart towards our Lord. And we'll see you again next time. Bye for now.